Hi everyone. I'm going to show you the solution to a really fairly straightforward problem that I came up with, just to write a little bit of R code to save myself some time. And in the doing of it, it occurred to me that it might be illustrative to show you how I break down the problem. Because when you look at the line of code, when you're new to R, it looks really overwhelming. But if I break it down into pieces, it might give you some insight about how to write and interpret R code that has these nested functions, especially when you're using apply. So let me first tell you the problem. The problem is I have 12 grades from one of my classes. There's about 100 students in it, and I wanted the average of the top 10 grades. And I had all the data in a spreadsheet, so it's easy enough for me to have done this manually if I transposed the data and so on. But it was if you just kind of visualize it, it's kind of a pain in the butt, because taking the top 10 grades means you have to exclude 2 of the 12 grades, and it wasn't even consistent. Some students didn't do all 12 quizzes. Some did 11, some did 9. So I wanted to do this programmatically. I didn't want to do this by hand. So I wrote this little function here, which I'm highlighting, and this does the work. It takes all the grades for each student, and it takes the top 10 of them, and it takes the mean or the average of that top 10, and it sends it to a data frame. So now I'm going to break it down for you and show you how I solved the problem. First of all, I'm going to create the data set, and I'm going to turn it into a data frame. So imagine that this is the data set we've got. We've got a grades. Let's say these are all proportions where 0 is 0 out of 0 out of 10, and 1 would be 10 out of 10. So these are all grades for students. I've got 10 students and 12 grades. Now, the function I wrote is here. This is it. And what it will do is, if I'll just run it, and I'll show you, is it uses apply and a nested series of functions, which I'll explain in detail here, to come up with a mean for each student that's based on the top 10 grades. So it's not the mean of all 12, it's only the mean of the top 10. And that's, like I said, it saved me a lot of time rather than doing this in Excel. But as I mentioned at the start, this is not immediately obvious to a new R user how to make sense of all this, because there's a lot of things going on. There's an apply function, there's a customized function within apply that I'm using to do this. So I want to break it down for you. So the first step to breaking it down is to remember when we're using this particular application of apply, what we're doing is we're going to be doing work. You can do work by column, by row, or by element. Typically, you wouldn't do it by element. Well, maybe under some circumstances you would. But what we're going to do is do work here for each row or column. In this particular case, we're doing work by row, and then we're going to return that result into an element within the data set. And rather than trying to deconstruct all of this, I'm going to pretend that we're doing this in a more piecemeal fashion. So imagine I wasn't using apply. The first task I have is to pull out the vector of data that I want to process. And in this case, because I'm working by row, what I actually have is 12 elements per row, and I want to turn that into this is just an exercise. This is something you actually do, but it's to illustrate what's going on here. I turned that row into a vector first. So that's what this X step is here. So let's say for the first row, if you look over to the right, you can see, well, actually, let me do this again. I run this. You can see that there are 12 observations. These 12 observations are in an array X. And these are the 12 grades for the first student. So we're kind of going student by student. So we're going to the first row just for illustrative purposes, and I've turned that row into a vector that we're going to then process. Now that I've got that row, now I'm going to sort it. This little function will sort that row, and it's just going to return the sorted vector. If you look here, you can see it's sorted from lowest value to highest value for that student. Now I'm going to take that result and I'm going to nest it in another function, and this function is going to take the tail. So the bottom, well, in this case, the top 10. You can actually do it in either direction. There's a number of different ways you can apply this, but this is going to take the top 10 of those grades. You can see it dropped these 2 bottom grades. So the first part was to sort it. The second part was to take the top 10 of these grades. And then the third part is to take the mean of the top 10 of those grades, and it's going to return that value. It's 0.79, so on. Okay, so the mean of the top 10 grades is about 80% for this particular student. this made-up data. Now that's breaking this down into one step. But you wouldn't want to do this for each student. This would be a pain. You'd have to increment this value or nest it in a loop. But that's a lot of code. You can put it inside the apply function. How do I do it? Well, I specify the data frame as the first argument. The second argument, I'm specifying that I'm working by row. And the third argument, what I do is I put this function x, and then I nest all of these parts into one nested function here. We have sort as the inner function, then you have tail as this middle function, and mean as the outer function. And it's going to return this resulting mean for each record. And x is kind of a placeholder. It's that vector that I'm using. The vector I created here, well, apply is just doing that for me. It's the whole use of apply, so I don't have to go through the step of breaking it apart. It's going to go through the process of pulling out these vectors, these rows, processing them in here, and then returning the result for each row. And that's how I get the average mark for the top 10 grades for each student. So that's just an illustration of the process where you kind of break it down. And to really to learn any programming language, you kind of just have to try these kinds of things out. But it might be useful if you've never done this kind of thing before to see the basic structure here where I'm pulling the data out. I'm imagining pulling the data out. That I'm imagining there's a whole bunch of these functions, and then I'm reconstituting it inside this apply function. So it's kind of this one elegant chunk of code. All right, that's all for today. Bye.